Gluten is the name that we use, the collective name we use for the different proteins that are found in wheat, rye, spelt, and barley. And there are people who are not able to eat gluten or are sensitive to eating gluten, and therefore there are many foods that are labeled as being gluten-free. Well, those four grains that I just mentioned, wheat, rye, spelt, and barley, are four of the grains that can become chametz, and therefore there's a common misconception that if something is gluten-free, then it must be not chametz either, because if it doesn't have any of those grains, then how could it possibly be chametz? So there are four reasons why that assumption is not correct. The first is, though I mentioned four grains, there are actually five grains that become chametz. The fifth one is oats. Oats inherently is free of gluten. Sometimes it gets intertwined and mixed with gluten, but you can buy gluten-free oats. So there are many gluten-free products that have oats in them, which would be chametz, and therefore we can't know just because it's gluten-free that it's therefore not a chametz concern. Second is, even if there are none of the five grains in it, the Ashkenazi custom is to not eat kitnias, which includes corn and rice and soy and many other things that are actually very common in gluten-free products. They take the place of the grains that cannot be in there. Thirdly is gluten-free is only thinks about whether there are actual gluten ingredients in it. Actually, there's a rule. It has to be less than, in the United States, less than 20 parts per million of gluten in there. However, the din is concerned about whether the equipment, the kalim, were used for chametz also, which is to say, is that we bake a chametz cake in a pan, and afterwards we bake a gluten-free cake in it. That in that same pan, that food would not be allowed to be eaten on Pesach either, because of the bli, is the absorbed taste that gets back into the chametz food, even though it might technically be gluten-free. And the fourth reason is that the definition of gluten and the definition of chametz are actually not the same. Gluten refers, as I mentioned, to a protein. It's the protein found in these different foods. And if we have a food made from one of the grains, and it has no protein in it, it could be gluten-free. While other parts of the grain, like the starch, may well be in there and still be chametz. Two examples of that are benefiber. Benefiber is made from wheat dextrin, which is it's 100% wheat. That's what the whole thing is. And yes, it's chametz, even though it's gluten-free, because they removed all of the protein. So people who are gluten-free won't react. It won't have any negative effect on them. But it's 100% chametz, and therefore, of course, it's not recommended. Another example is the Scotch Whiskey Association tells people that Scotch, the beverage Scotch, is okay for celiacs, and that's because the way Scotch is made, it only has the starch or the sugars from barley. Even though Scotch, of course, is 100% chametz. That's only basically the only ingredients are barley and water in it, and therefore it of course is chametz. So the fact that something could be marked as gluten-free, honestly marked as gluten-free, does not mean, for these four reasons why, even if something would be marked gluten-free, does not mean that it's free of chametz, and does not mean that we could use it on Pesach.